We now come to our Bible study for today, Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. We're just going to get right into it because we have kind of a two-story sandwich. That's what I call it. Not like two-story building, but two stories that are kind of sandwiched together. And it's not like there's one that's bread and one that's meat. They're all meat. They're all good. They're all important, but they're really talking about just this one same thing. But for our Bible study, we'll be focusing on the part of the story that makes up the bread of the sandwich, but they're all meat still. But the outsides of the story, a story about a man and his daughter that is in need of a lot of help. One commentary talked about these two stories being about one thing, and they said it in this way: Jesus can handle storms in nature, and Jesus can handle demons. But does Jesus care about our more common human woes? What does faith in Jesus mean? And how does it bring wholeness? It is absolutely amazing and wonderful and worthy of praise, all the things that Jesus was and did for us in those past moments. But so many times we want to know, when things are going wrong in my house, in your house, not globally, not the universe is at stake, but when something that just affects one or two people, just me and my family, we need to know, does God care? Can God do anything for me? This is that section of stories. So let's begin by reading through this story about Jesus and a leader of the synagogue and that man's daughter, starting in verse 21. And we will be skipping past the story of the hemorrhaging woman that'll be picked up for the sermon. So verse 21, and we're going to read the whole thing here. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. A little while later, while Jesus was still speaking about the miracle we'll talk about in the sermon, so this is verse 35, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? This child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Now, even though we cut out part of the section, we need to note that these sandwich stories, as I like to call them, they're an example of something that Mark likes to do on a regular basis. It's more commonly referred to as the technique of insertion, having another story be inserted or break up the quote-unquote main story. It's done to increase the tension. Will Jesus make it there in time? and to intensify the severity of the problem. It goes from illness to death, which some would say is more severe. But it also helps to highlight the initial question we got to in the introduction. What does faith in Jesus mean? It brought Jairus all the way, knowing that Jesus was the only way. It brought Jairus all that way, knowing that Jesus was the only way. And it will bring the later woman forward as she knows that Jesus is the only way to her healing. Faith may be described as many things, but here we know that it's about realizing that it is Jesus who provides the way forward and taking that leap to make it happen. Now, when we dig into Jairus, one of the rulers of the synagogue, we get a lot. The ruler was the administrative head of the synagogue. He was the president, responsible for the good management of the synagogue. He was responsible for the conduct of the services. He did not usually take part, didn't lead them himself, but was responsible for assigning duties. The ruler of the synagogue was one of the most important and respected people in the community. But all that falls away when his daughter becomes ill. One commentary notes that two things happen because of that. His prejudice was forgotten, and his dignity was forgotten. Given everything we have heard up to this point, we know that Jairus would have regarded Jesus as an outsider, most likely a heretic, and a person that should be avoided, if not condemned. But this Jairus is a big enough person to abandon his prejudice in his hour of need. Prejudice means to judge beforehand. But the call of Christ is clear. We must drop our prejudices, whatever they are, and follow God's calling. About his dignity, he was the ruler of the synagogue. People came to him. He didn't go to them. And yet he throws himself at the feet of Jesus. We must never think too highly of ourselves that we can't ask for help when we need it. Realize how much God can and do for us. We should note once again that this is a miracle story. It's funny to say, but we almost get used to the miracles happening in Mark. They become old news. It almost seems like there are too many of them. Can you get sick of miracles? It almost seems possible in Mark. One story to the next. Jesus shows you who he is by what he does. That's how Mark works. It's not a big explain it, it's a big show it. It's all about that action. And even though this is a miracle story, it's a little different than normal. There's a worsening of the problem, which is unusual for a miracle story. With the divided up sections, it allows the severity to grow, but it also allows us to see who Jesus is actually battling. Because you need a villain in any storytelling, and it's not just illness anymore, but death itself that Jesus is combating. And when Jesus sees death show its ugly head, his response, do not fear, only believe. For death is sleep to Jesus. And he knows better than anyone that this little girl will arise, as we will arise once again. It's hard to think about death in any other way than the most tragic of events. And it is tragic, it is heartbreaking, it's hard to be separated temporarily from our loved ones. But Jesus has a completely different way of looking at it that we are meant to understand and use. That death is but sleep, death is but a temporary separation from our loved ones. The other departure from the normal miracle story is that after the miracle, after the reaction, and after Jesus' command to silence, the story should end, but it doesn't here. Here Jesus says, give her something to eat. Some say this breaking from the norm is done to prove that she wasn't a ghost, as ghosts don't eat. But others make a more lovely interpretation, that this addition shows a warm and human Jesus for whom this 12-year-old girl was not just a case, but a little girl. There's a big word in this section, and I don't mean in length or complexity, but what it can do for our lives. That word is believe. How far can our belief take us? Our section has this: while Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" The world and everyone around Jairus told him to give up. But what did his faith tell him? Why did he not stop troubling the teacher any further? Because he believed, beyond anything he could see, that Jesus could do more. And he was right. Which brings us to another word, which connects back to why I think Jesus had them feed the little girl. A word that's translated made well. Come and lay your hand on her so that she may be made well, is Jairus' initial request. And this word also shows up in the story about the woman in need of healing that we'll get to in the sermon. For there she also uses the same word. But almost every other place, this made well is not simply made well, nor is it just physical wellness, but the word is really save. Come and lay your hands on my daughter so that she may be saved. This daughter proves to be our ultimate example. The saving Jairus asked for as a sparing of a life turned out to be a restoration to life after death, one commentary says. And when we get to see that even after that restoration, Jesus makes sure that she is fed. Jesus continues to feed us even after we have been claimed, set free, and restored. We are the little girl in this story. We should act with the faith and belief and passion of Jairus, all the while knowing that Jesus is going to take care of us and wants us to look at the world differently. That's it for the Bible study on this section, but we will be getting into another part of this sandwich in the sermon in just a little bit. So thank you for joining me for today for this Bible study.